Back in the day, while I would be waiting at the front yard of my school, waiting for the doors to open, I would be stoked to see an acquaintance of mine pop up playing Angry Birds on his phone, while me and many other interested would watch him play. And within a stretch of years, I became an addict for Angry Birds, getting it downloaded on my parents' personal devices before getting my own and just constantly playing down to its core. But a little kid in me would never have guessed it that Sony Pictures would come forward and give us a literal movie adapting Angry Birds. But its caliber was not what crossed my mind. We ended up going from this to a world where they would have arms and legs.
Oh, I've got arms and legs and everything.
Let me just rephrase that. They can now all move their arms and legs like Kevin Everett when he was recovering.
He moved his arms and legs today.
What's up guys, it's Willie and welcome back to another video. And today, I'm talking about Sony Pictures' Angry Birds movie adaptation based from the original game itself. The movie came out around May of 2016, which if you know the drill, this year marks it a decade ago, which is just an insane that this movie franchise premiered that long ago, which could be the epitome of time being able to fly more than these birds themselves. So getting into the essence of this notion of an Angry Birds franchise, it's like a pretty perplexing adaptation where, I mean, coming from myself, I'm not like the biggest Angry Birds nerd of them all. I would say I'm more middle of the road. Like I mentioned, I am familiar with the original game. I also have played like the Star Wars Space and Rio iterations of the game, and I also watched the Angry Birds tunes, which they were a blast. So I'm pretty much middling average for my sort of familiarity with the franchise of the Angry Birds game. Now to thread the needle here, coming into this movie as a fan, it was something that wasn't really high on my expectations, especially with the obvious elephant in the room with the modelings of our birds and pigs, which are definitely not to any of the quality that we endorse on, but I still wanted to keep an open mind to this shift in design and not be so conservative. But I can admit, I recall watching the first movie when it came out and just feeling whelmed by it. Now, it was already foreseeable that this was a film directed towards very young children, and it debuted when I was already over the age of 10. So a lot of what this movie was trying to crack down did not necessarily meet with my personal taste in good quality of a movie. But it ain't eliminating the whole narrative of a rival between pigs and birds that I always had ingrained memories of growing up. And its popularity was so universally adored that not only was this movie making its debut, but it also would be followed up with a sequel just a few years later. And furthermore, there will be a third movie coming by the end of this year, which I'll gladly cover. We'll see how that goes. These films collectively has been met with some very mixed receptions, and since we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of the franchise's debut, I think it would be appropriate to revisit these films, give my final thoughts based on where I would rate them at this current point, and really determine if the Angry Birds movies are that good or do they really hit the mark that most critics view it as. Let's dive into the world of the Angry Birds franchise. Quick, before we divulge, tap like and subscribe so you won't miss out on future content like this down the road. Okay, enough yaps for me. Let's get on with this marathon. Angry Birds 1! Obviously the first and the introductory to the atmosphere of this franchise. And boy, we're in for it for something. But it's definitely not in the direction that I would be easily interpreting it as. But cutting to the brief sum up of the film, it opens up with Red being an outcasted figure who even his own community invalidates its existence. Leads to those factors being a main drive to his anger issues, which leads to a lot of his impulsive lashes that has done a lot of irreparable damage and effects on others. And is sentencing him into an anger management program, which I mean, not that surprising that that program is even there for the sake of a contradictory element to the whole trait of these birds, but otherwise, it's implemented into the story to be the thread that connects Red to his soon-to-be close friends, Bomb and Chuck. And their dynamic on the movie, especially from Red's side to them, just feels very incompatible, which is pretty funny that I'm using that word in the context of what happens in the sequel. But then again, I just feel like Red is not really reciprocating much of the mutual relationship with Bomb and Chuck. And it just feels like how the movie portrayed it felt a little bit more forced and more of a growing relationship between the three. And I just feel like the chemistry with their friendship is just not really crossing the threshold for me. But now we can push that on the sideline for a bit as we get the pig storyline into the movie, because no Angry Birds media comes without those egg-obsessed pigs. Leonard, the king of pigs, arrives with his assistant Ross in a ship where they are able to make their pleasant persona so convincing for the birds to make them feel more welcome into the community, which is unbeknownst to them that there was something a lot more sinister in the back of the pigs' minds. They were obviously oblivious to Leonard's ploys. Red, however, is personally skeptical of the pigs, and when he and his friends eventually find themselves on the ship, they do make the discovery of more stowaway pigs on board, which is such a dichotomy to the quantity of pigs Leonard had said point blank in the period, which was just 2. And so bringing it to the bird's intention to stir some doubt into the pigs would ultimately backfire on Red, as Leonard would bring up a pretty convincing story to this that further starts to isolate Red, and to where the community start to demonize him for his acts to turn away their guests, which as audience we know the reality speaks otherwise. But in this moment, it does hurt deeply to see how Red continues to be invalidated due to the negative perception he gets from others that link with their personal bias that muddies their proper mindset to branch out their perspectives more. And thus, the Birdie Island does get overwhelmed with the community of pigs who continue to play up this guest mold, but Red is still resolute on playing that detective role on the pigs, and he makes the final resort to seek help from the mighty eagle who, as a kid, he idolized for his courageous prowess and dedication to protect the bird community. So he and his friends arrive on the top of the Eagle Mountain, where they meet the said eagle, but not in the way that Red was hoping to get out of him.
Disgusting!
Instead, this so-called mighty ego is actually just an unserious, insecure douche who just tries to play off the tropes of his name to mask off his current state, which was definitely not the most stable in that light. And in essence of that, this culminates with his refusal to help out Red as soon as him and the others discover the pig's true intentions on damaging the island and stealing the bird's eggs. So in other words, his only response to the eagle is reprimanding him for only focusing on his glory past instead of actually trying to sustain living up to it in the present, and thus losing his respect of idolizing him. Anyways, the trio tries their best to put a hindrance on the pig's plans, but unfortunately, these wannabe green eggs and ham would just get the upper stick on them, thus stealing all the eggs to take back to Piggy Island and leaving all the birds back at their now damaged home completely in sorrow. Red finally gets a bit of his validation with an apology from the community for not believing him earlier, and shifting things around, they now start putting trust in him to lead the charge against the pigs, so they construct their own boat and bring along a big slingshot that the pigs gave them earlier. And I think we finally get to the action sequence that we've been truly waiting for from this movie, especially from big Angry Bird nerds of the mall. Like, the ultimate standout with the use of the slingshot was great and what we really needed to anticipate for. While I'll say a tad underwhelmed that we didn't get as much with it as I would have liked it for, considering it is the key mechanic that ultimately structured the concept of what the Angry Birds game was. So then otherwise, these last 30 minutes of the film do pertain to very action-packed sequences, with the birds being able to retrieve their eggs and the mighty eagle joining in to help out, but one falls back during the escape, leading to Red having to be the hero in retrieving on his own, which as expected wasn't going to be a smooth ride. He at least did succeed in his heroism, and his dedication was honored by the birds community, and thus even leading to his homie repair and move back in place within the core of Birdie Island, which was a great way to wrap up his arc from this movie. And talking about whatever happened to Leonard and the piggies, well, I guess their love of dynamite did become friendly fire to them, just amping up the stakes here. I actually personally don't mind much of this film, but it is heavily flawed. That explains its very mixed reading on many of those popular critic pages, and I think I can easily go over what those main factors are. I mean, the plot itself is just not the most masterful in the world. I'm not saying the storytelling is bad, it's just not as elegantly special in some way to make it feel more amplified from the more stereotypical tropes of these themes. I just often tend to believe outside of Red and Leonard, I feel like most of the characters are just there, not having any sort of impact on the story. Plus, furthermore, it feels like this movie leans heavily on its comedy and wackiness that makes a lot of the sequences just so unserious, and it gets way too overt that I'm just kind of overwhelmed by it, that is just lessening my entertainment from it, as we're not really giving much to really breathe, to have more sobering moments or any sort of deep connections. Like back when the scene when Red expresses his letdown by the eagle. Yes, a scene like this follows the trope of those idolized figures being reprimanded in some ways, but I don't think this one really gives that much of an emotional impact than what it tries to convey. And a lot of that just stems from the eagle's lack of sufficient screen time and his portrayal on the movie, which is done where we really can't take him seriously, and this is just what reduces the deep effects of this scene. And it's nothing like compared to movies that came later on in the future with like Gold, where we had that brief moment of Will chastising his idol Jet Fillmore, and it feels like it had a lot more to impact because Jet's role in that movie is more of a contrast to the unserious child screen time Eagle had in this one. And then I can get people will probably bring up the argument that it's just a wacky film and that everyone is is portrayed to be clowned on. However, it doesn't mean that we can at least have a moment to really hit hard for us emotionally. Like from the DreamWorks side, we had Dogman from last year, and it was a wacky filled movie, but it still mixed elegantly with a very strong plot and integrated very deep moments that felt like very true hits emotionally. And it's unfortunately the antithesis to this moment with how choppy it was portrayed, and obviously the really flawed writing on top of that. But this movie doesn't come with some glows too. Like the characters, in terms of their own characteristic qualities, they actually come off very relatable. I mean, Red in particular is the main heart of the movie just for his arc alone. And I was intrigued watching him come to his own, even having his own Dildo-ish moments that lingers in my mind. I feel like if you were really a long time Angry Birds fan, there would be some really good eye-catching references if you would be able to recognize them on the spot. And the whole final showdown sequence was definitely the biggest part to this movie after on a pretty middling pace to start off with. Still, overall, just a pretty mixed bag of a movie. I do find it radically fine, but its heavy-handed flaws are keeping it from popping more, so out of 10, I would definitely rate it around 6-ish, definitely like something like a 6.7 would be the suitable spot to rate this. Just a fine movie. Anyways, we move on to Angry Birds 2. Really, for a brief preface, it's definitely the edgier one of the two, where it feels like they take a lot of the main flawed elements from the first movie and took that to a further extreme, where the plot is very puzzling. Like, I don't really think I can get behind on this one when it comes to its storytelling, because it's just such a bloated mess with its excessive humor and slapstick that, as I mentioned, went to a more further extreme, just with how loose and choppy it was presented. But for a brief overview of what it was, the film opens up its first several minutes of the birds and pigs just having a prank war, because obviously that's the trend in pop culture during its time, which I shall mention that there's just so much pop culture references that are integrated in these films based on the time that they're made. Yeah, they are a cool little touch, but at times they do come off extremely cringy to me, especially in this film in particular, just with how excessive they were with it. But anyways, we check back on Red, where he is still looked at as a hero, but he kind of takes too much of that glory on his name to the detriment with his insecurity. So to ease him up, his friends would offer him the opportunity to participate in the speed dating, which of course it wouldn't have been a shock to see this film go all in on romanticizing our protagonist with a very attractive female character. And I'll admit, that was the probable case, because Silver comes into the mix. Oh mother! Okay, seriously, she is actually going to be a mother in the third film, but still, this film wouldn't have been the same without this mothering queen. But surely, obviously, it was so see-through what they were going for between her and Red's relationship. But anyways, surely the biggest plot twist of them all, she is the sister of Chuck. Like, I gave a crap about that. However, what we do need to care for is that there's now a third leg to the shenanigans going on between Bird and Piggy Island, where we're introduced to this movie's villain, Zeta, which, as a villain, she didn't really pop for the kind of energy that would make her come off more menacing than one that we just couldn't take seriously, and just overall a tad cheesy with her role. Anyways, in other words, to emphasize on her motives, it's just out of pure unhappiness with her own world, so she essentially wants to expand on that by destroying the other islands, expand on her space. With her brief attacks with just ice spheres leads to Leonard and Red making a truce and recruiting the most valuable allies they can in the likes of Chuck, Bomb, and Silver on the Bird side. Meanwhile, Leonard brings along Courtney, who was a new character that, I'll be honest, fell a bit shallow with her role, and then later on Gary would be a tag along too. On top of that, the Mighty Eagle would be part of the adventure as well, which wonder what relevance he's gonna have, especially when the group would outline their plan and identify the culprit they're dealing with his reactions came out very cagey. And so when they make their arrival to the culprit's island is when Eagle finally opens up about his previous relationship with Zeta being his ex-fiance who he had abandoned out of pure cowardness, and just like the past, he ends up cowering out of the adventure and just dips right back to his home, leaving the remaining group to deal with Zeta themselves. And towards the back third of the film, we spend it mostly on this heist sequence that kind of panders out a bit, and throughout it we just get more of the romance between Red and Silver, where they're starting to get close, like literally. Oh, for goodness sakes. You know, I'd rather watch the birds dancing to Baby Shark than just watching this shoehorned love story that could just stay in the incompatible spectrum. But anywho, just breaking down everything in just quick session, the group's plan to stop Zeta unfortunately fail, but unsurprisingly, the eagle comes to the rescue to essentially mend fences with Zeta for what he did in the past, and always could have been impactful if it wasn't for all the jarring nature with these films that leads to this just not being taken seriously. And on top of that, we just had to have that twist that the assistant for Zeta was actually her daughter and Eagle was her biological dad. Like, who even cares at this point? I feel like a lackluster twist like that makes flawed Disney twist villains more superior. There's also a little side plot that we kept occasionally checking in on throughout this movie involving hatchlings who lose their parents' eggs and go on this massive journey to retrieve them, which, okay, the only merit they have is their involvement near the end of the plot when they contribute in backfiring Zeta's operation against her own base, causing it to blow up in the process, which I guess good karma for her. But I feel like it would have been better off without them in the scene anyway, as it felt like it was only shoehorned there just for the sake of making their subplot matter more, when it feels more episodic and definitely more belonging in a spin-off series. Anywho, fences are mended between Zeta and Eagle and they get married, just so abruptly like that. And then I guess we can get some closure to the red and silver romance where they are now started to have their affair as well. So yeah, that's the second film for you. I feel like from more of a plot perspective, it does have much better merits than the first film, but I feel like in terms of impact and arc, it just doesn't hold up compared to the first. I mean, Red in this movie, I will admit, came off a tad bit terrible, just from his immense hubris and selfishness that sort of feel like the completion of his arc from the last film just led to more of a downplay on his character this film, and that's just a rough feeling as I sympathized him a lot in the first film, but this film, he is less of that caliber and a more insecure, self-absorbed hypocrite who feels like he's got a lot more to learn in the long run, and especially fatherhood, because you know what I'm saying. In spite of all the strange edginess with this film, it does feel a bit more of an appeal than the first one, with a much more astonishing conclusion for all the characters involved. And lastly, this film gave us Mother. Like, to repeat, she's literally gonna live up to her motherhood next film. Anywho, the film, in my opinion, is a lot more by the numbers. I mean, plot-wise, it's definitely better. I think at least certain arcs are more redeemed here, even though Red's in particular was a regression. In all this essence, I think this film would probably get a 6.9 out of 10 for me. By far, these two films, while I don't mind, they are very whelming to me. Like, they don't really make a great impact for me in general, and it feels like they are a bit too hungry for that fan service, but yet they are not executing it in some level of gravitas that actually feels like there really is care put into making these feel more impactful. And I think from my personal lens, just collectively from these two films, the franchise just isn't one that I would highly recommend for you to watch, which from a more practicality sake, I would definitely not prioritize it if you're having the best day of your life. Like, this film is better off on your leisure time if you're just bored and just want to watch something on a more random spectrum. Likewise, this film franchise just feels more middle of the road. I do think at times I'm just like head scratching on like where the plots are and is there any sort of dedicated purpose to these films rather than just being a product that you would find in a circus. And it's not hard to assign most of these characters the clown makeup session that can be the suitable touch for them in this franchise, and I can at least get some laughs from them. Not that I didn't have at least a good chunk of that throughout my watch through of these films. Though it is with these films that leave up the questioners, what is it with their purpose and how warranted they are? Like, garnering questions like that reveals a lot of the flawed factors that this franchise seems to be missing out with its gravity. Like, we're gonna spend minutes of the birds fantasizing on the mighty eagle's shaking bum over dedicating to creating a meaningful message out of these films, with intention too. Like, again, in every front, it's obviously the faces of these young children that are gonna be seeing this rather than critics and film analyzers like myself and many other fellow creators who endorse on enjoying films and the fun of divulging into its message and meanings, and this franchise can't make a strong example of that, unfortunately, just stuck in its middle at best. So that does it with where I'm wrapping it up. While I can get the strong merit to some of the moral and themes these films tries to exude, it is just unfortunately conjunction with the overwhelming brain rot that puts such a reduction to the wholesomeness of the films and making them more shallow just from the other end of the stick. But nonetheless, in spite of all these whelming factors, this doesn't stop the franchise from continuing on its train with the third movie that's nearing by soon. I'll just say good luck, we'll see how well that performs. Please feel free to share your thoughts down below in the comments, but I shall sign up here. I appreciate you guys tuning in and we'll see you all in the next video.